Thank you, Tony. So this is something that we've been working on clinically for about 20 years now. We think it's a very important source of examination abnormalities and a very treatable phenomenon in the illness. So neurodynamics refers to the interaction of nerve mechanics or movement and nerve physiology. What got us interested in this was observations in adolescents with the illness who had an increased prevalence of these postural abnormalities that you can see on this slide, where this young man had a lot of thoracic kyphosis, a head-forward posture, and we noticed that doing maneuvers with his legs, like straight leg raise up to about 20 degrees, which ought to be well tolerated by anybody, would provoke his headaches, as would hip flexion. And as we looked at more and more of our patients, we recognized that people who, had marked restrictions in range of motion. So healthy individual could get to 60 degrees of straight leg raise without developing stretch, whereas our patients were feeling that 20 degrees was uncomfortable enough to stop raising the leg. They also reported that their symptoms would be reproduced by these examination maneuvers. So we could reproduce classic ME/CFS symptoms by selectively placing tension on the neural tissues. So as an example of this, we brought in two young men who had ME/CFS, and we exposed them to a serial process where we raised the leg 10 degrees, waited 2 minutes, measured heart rate, blood pressure, pulse oximetry. We were at the time thinking that we were aggravating their autonomic nervous system function and that we'd see some circulatory problems. We then lifted the leg another 10 degrees to 20 degrees, then 30, 40, 50, and 60. So it was a 12-minute test, and we were ranking their symptom severity on a 0 to 10 scale. And here's what we found. So the individual came in with a fatigue score in red of about 5.5. As we raised the leg further, the fatigue got worse. Lightheadedness in blue got worse, even though we were improving the venous return to his heart by raising his leg in the supine position. He got very cognitively foggy, and by the middle point of the test was unable to answer our questions about symptom severity with any speed, even got visual blurring. At the end of the 12 minutes, the leg was placed down. The two boys that had this test performed then needed about an hour of crackers and Gatorade to get up off the table and feel safe enough to drive home. So neurodynamics, as I mentioned, is this interaction of nerve mechanics and nerve physiology. The basic concept is that as the bones, muscles, and joints and connective tissues move in daily life, they impose forces on the neural tissues. The nerves must elongate, slide, angulate around joints, and then undergo compression. And these mechanical stresses can evoke physiologic responses. The consequences are, first, when the nerve is stretched, you get a protective increase in resting muscle tone. The body is attempting to prevent further stretch of that nerve, but that increases the energy expenditure of that muscle and reduces the person's ease of movement. Neurophysiologically, you can see a reduction in intraneural blood flow, decreased electrical conduction, and sometimes intraneural swelling. There's increased mechanical sensitivity. People have recorded autonomic responses like sweating, altered blood flow to the tissues, and in some experimental situations, you see a release of inflammatory neuropeptides. We followed up our original observations with a cohort study of adolescents where we looked at the prevalence of range of motion. We were looking at 11 different items. I won't go through them, but we generated a range of motion score that went from 0, no restrictions, to 11, which was the maximal number of restrictions. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you see paired patients who are matched by sex and level of joint hypermobility. The CFS patients had a much higher median number on the range of motion score of 5 compared to 2 in the healthy controls. On the right side is the same patients followed for 2 years with repeated measurements. They were exposed to multidisciplinary treatment. Many of them got physical therapy, addressing the movement restrictions, And you can see the same range of motion score in the purple, and these same patients at the end of 24 months had shifted down to where you see the distribution in black. So the range of motion score improved in correlation with their improvements in overall health-related quality of life. We then followed this up with a repeat of our initial pilot study, exposing people in a randomized trial to either a real straight leg raise strain or a sham strain. And we measured 5 of the classic ME/CFS symptoms. These were fatigue, body pain, lightheadedness, difficulty concentrating, and headaches. And what this slide shows is the percent of people who had at least a 2-point increase in their symptom intensity, and on the x-axis is the number of symptoms that increased by 2 points. So these are ME/CFS patients compared with the strain compared with the sham, and at each point you see a big increase in the increased intensity of symptoms if they had the true straight leg raise strain, and by the number of patients who had at least 3 symptoms with a 2-point increase was 47% in the strain arm and 14% in the sham arm. And the other interesting point was that at 24 hours, we also saw an increase in symptoms. 44% versus 18% had 3 symptoms or more, increasing by 2 points. So there's a suggestion that this is capable of reproducing PEM. So our conclusion is that a longitudinal strain that's applied to the nerves and perineural soft tissues of the lower limb is capable of increasing symptom intensity in individuals with the illness for up to 24 hours, consistent with PEM. We would add that this isn't restricted to neural tension on the lower limb. It can occur in the upper limb as well. These findings confirmed our preliminary observations that an increased mechanical sensitivity is a contributor to the provocation of symptoms in the illness. The mechanisms for transduction of that neuromuscular strain into increased symptoms are not known, but I want to emphasize that these are neutral with regard to all of the etiologic hypotheses you've heard at this conference. So, for example, if one believes that neurotropic viruses are the problem, you could get intraneural edema that follows infection, contributing to adverse neural tension. You could get infectious or immune-mediated neuroinflammation. You could get inflammation due to suboptimal intraneural blood flow in those with hypotension and orthostatic intolerance. Stretch is known to activate mast cells, so excessive neural strain can, we think, trigger mast cell activation. And there are other deformative stresses in the nervous system due to ligamentous laxity like one sees in Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or other neuroanatomic problems. The increase in symptoms with the imposition after an otherwise fairly mild mechanical strain like straight leg raise is consistent with the presence of an inflamed, non-compliant, and mechanically sensitized nervous system. So if a simple and relatively brief straight leg raise can provoke symptoms, then prolonged or excessive strain beyond the person's usual range of motion in daily life might be followed by a similar exacerbation. And our clinical experience, we haven't studied this formally, but our general impression over the last 2 decades is that treating these areas of movement restriction using gentle manual forms of physical therapy, not exercise-based, but manual forms, improves the ability of many patients to tolerate the gradual increases in activity that get them back to normal function. My main collaborators in this work have been Rick Violand, a physical therapist in the Baltimore area, and Kevin Fontaine, who's now at UAB. And just wanted to thank the others who were part of this.